Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing.
Christopher Hawkins.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Molly. How are you?
I'm doing great too. So, can you tell me about what you've written?
Sure. The first book that I put out a little over a year and a half ago, is called Suburban Monsters. It's a collection of short stories from, sort of throughout my writing career. So it spans like a good decade, and it's got a little bit of everything for everyone. It has some cosmic horror, some body horror, clowns, mannequins, weird sea creatures, a little, kind of covers a lot of horror bases. But they're all kind of themed around the idea of the horrors that are happening right next door. So there's that, and then more recently, I published my debut novel, Downpour, which is about a family that's trapped inside of a crumbling farmhouse when this weird rain starts to fall. That's eating away at their home and turning everyone around them into monsters. So yeah, and then the third one is a novella that I've just recently put out, and this I'm kind of doing. There's a little bit of an experiment. I'm only selling it at conventions and different appearances that I do throughout the year. But it's called The Sharp Knife Against Bone. It is a horror crime thriller about a casino in the 1960s in Las Vegas, where a this strange magic act shows up and starts to upend the plans of a gentleman who is trying to get the top job at his father-in-law's casino. So it's a lot of revenge, a lot of blood, a lot of intrigue as well. So that's the most recent thing.
Those all sound so fantastic. So, can you tell me a little bit about what horror means to you as a horror author?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, horror, it's just always been kind of a part of my blood. It's been one of those things that even when I was kind of too young to be reading Stephen King, I was reading Stephen King. And that the fact that you had these like very sort of scary and transgressive ideas that are being put down on paper and really inspiring people, because this was in the 80s, so like everyone was talking about Stephen King. He was like everywhere. He had commercials on TV, which is not something that really authors do anymore, I don't think. But yeah, I mean, he was just like everywhere. He was just completely ubiquitous, and I just loved the idea of being able to capture people's imagination with scary things. So it's always kind of just been something that I've strived for, and something that I've tried to do in my own work.
Oh, that's so cool. So, kind of a question a little bit more about like the craft of writing, but now that you've had a short story collection published and a novel and a novella, how do you know what format each thing will take? Is that something that starts at the beginning of the idea or that you discover as you write?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Usually, I know going in whether something's going to be, a short story or a novella. Sometimes, I like. Uh, I'm working on a piece currently that will probably end up being either a series of novellas or a novel in parts, right? And I'm not quite sure exactly which way that's going to go, but really the distinction between the two is, more of a marketing thing than it is an actual like creativity thing. So it's not really changing the way the stories are presented. So yeah, I mean, I can't really think of anything where I started on a book and said, well, this really needs to be a short story. Usually I have a pretty good idea of about how much uh, time it's going to take to tell whatever story I'm setting out to tell.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So, which type of thing do you prefer writing?
I like short stories, I think, a little bit better just because you're able to get a complete thing out quicker. So it's a little more, not quite instant gratification, but the gratification isn't anywhere near as delayed as it is with a novel. So um, I think short stories are probably a little bit more fun, but um, a novel or a longer piece, like the novella that I just put out, those tend to be a little bit more rewarding because they end up being a part of your life for so much longer. They take a lot more care to put together, and they take a lot more, a lot more effort, a lot more, thinking about it over an extended period of time. So those really become sort of more of a part of your life than than a short story that you write in a few days and edit, and a couple weeks later it's finished and it's out of your brain.
Oh yeah, totally. So Downpour is, I mean, it's
Mhm.
just such an incredible idea with the rain and how it's turning people into monsters around them and everything. I have to know what inspired that.
You know, it's hard for me to kind of think back because it was kind of tied up around a lot of anxiety, that was sort of happening at the time. So it was kind of conceived, during the like the tail end of the whole pandemic thing. So there was a lot of anxiety kind of in my own head about being trapped, and and of course, my kids are getting older, so family dynamic of dealing with kids who are not necessarily children anymore, they're becoming young adults, and how then do I as a father kind of recontextualize our relationship, and still be a dad in those instances. And then just kind of married that to a lot of um just sort of ecological fears that we have right now. I mean, it's happening, as we're talking, it's happening right now in Florida. There's, this tropical storm that's kind of just moving very slow and bringing this like 1,000 year rain event that was never really something that, I had to worry about growing up. This is part of our changing world. And so I think all of those elements kind of sort of came together as I was conceiving the book, and it came together relatively fast. I mean, there are some stories where even a short story, it's like, okay, well, I have an idea, I have no idea how to realize that. So I might take months or sometimes even years with this germ of an idea, but then nothing to really wrap it around. Stephen King talks about having a cup but no handle, and that's really what it kind of feels like in a lot of cases. But with this, it just came together really, really quickly, and it felt like I had this very clear idea of who the people in the story were and where the story was going to go. So that was, it just kind of took all those elements and just kind of ran.
Everything you're saying there is touching on exactly why I love horror and why so many of the
Mhm.
authors that come on the show love horror, because it really is such a medium where you can express those feelings and represent it through this sort of otherworldly lens that can almost feel safer at times to look at. And that's I love hearing the description behind the writing there.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's um, when people ask like how you put these things together, it always feels like it's nothing profound, right? It's just, well, I have an idea, I worked on that idea, I just keep working on that idea, and it never really feels like anything. I think people are used to having writers portrayed in media as having these like eureka moments. And sometimes that does happen, but really it's just a lot of like work and, noodling over ideas and then writing down notes and then backtracking when things don't start, aren't really coming together. So it's really just work when you come right down to it. It's just effort. Um, but I'm glad that it turned out all right in this case.
So, talking about writing as work, what does the work look like for you?
It's been hard lately, just over the past few months, to kind of get back into a routine on a new piece. So, for me, I've been kind of writing in fits and starts. But when I'm really into a story, I try to write every day. I don't have a lot of time to devote to it because of other things going on in my life. But I try to block out that time consistently, and really just if all I have is an hour in a day, then I'm going to spend that hour working on a story, and I'll get however far I get. But the story is kind of always in my brain too, so there's a lot of working through ideas throughout the day, even when I'm not sitting in front of the computer, putting words down. I'm still kind of thinking about the characters and thinking about the situations. It's yeah, it's kind of like an all-encompassing thing.
For
It sort
sure.
of takes over your brain for a while.
Well, so what is your research process and like outlining look like if you do that?
Yeah, no, I don't outline. I like to kind of discover the story as I'm putting together the first draft, which means that I do a lot of backtracking and a lot of sort of rewriting and a lot of, sticking notes in like the earlier chapters saying I have to establish this and I have to establish that. All the foreshadowing kind of comes in the later part of that second draft where I'm smoothing everything out and making everything kind of fit together and make sense. Um, but yeah, in terms of research, though, I like to research just enough to get started with the story. So I like to, I'm working on a piece right now that's kind of a period piece set around like the 1920s, and it's also another kind of rural Illinois story. So I'm kind of trying to get a sense of that time period in that place, and then once I have that to kind of latch onto, then it's easier um, to move forward with the story. And then as I'm writing, I'll be adding more research just to kind of keep immersed in the time. And then again, sometimes I'll come across a detail or I'll come across a fact that'll require me to go and change what I've written before, but that's okay because then, I'm already kind of in the middle of it. I feel like if I, there are a lot of writers I think that do a lot of research up front, and my problem with that is that if I did that, I'd never get started. There's always one more book
I'm
to read. There's always
so
one more piece. Yeah, and I really have to be wary of that with myself. That if I get too deep into that process, then I'm going to neglect the rest of it. And yeah, so that's something that I try to avoid, but it seems to work out.
interesting. Yeah. No, I am the same way with the research process where it can become so overwhelming or so exciting sometimes. Like I love history and everything, so I'll just go so deep in that I never start the actual writing. And
Right.
it can be hard, yeah.
Mhm.
So kind of on that same note, what is the hardest part of writing a book for you?
First draft is always the hardest. I feel like I'm a better editor than I am a writer. So when I have something in front of me that's broken, I can usually put it together and make it work. But getting to the point where I have that sort of broken creation, it's like getting all of that like clay together and getting it in a shape that sort of approximates the story that I'm trying to tell. That's always the difficult part for me is those first steps. But then once that's all done, then it becomes a lot more fun because I'm constantly improving here and there. I'm getting to know certain characters and situations in a way that I didn't necessarily know them when I did that first draft. So that process of correcting and refining and editing and improving, that's really the part of it I feel like where I feel like I feel most like a writer, like, okay, well, I'm actually doing this thing as opposed to just slogging through like, oh God, I have no idea what this character is going to do next.
So with the editing
Yes,
being the part that you connect the most to, do you have any trunk
uh-huh.
novels? Do you have any
I
books where you
do.
didn't get to that
Yeah,
stage?
I do. Yeah, because like my path to publishing, 'cause I self-publish my stuff now, but I've had three agents in the past, and I've gone through that whole process of submission and getting an agent to like your work enough to represent you and then send it down on submission. And the beginning of that process kind of hit some problems with timing because like when my first book was ready to go out on sub, that's when Donald Trump was elected. So then suddenly there was this big shift in the publishing industry, at least from what she told me, that they were more looking for political nonfiction than they were for fiction at that time. So my book just kind of got buried, and then it's just been this sort of like struggle to kind of get to a point where that uh, where I could be like in a productive part of that process.
Mhm.
So I just kind of got to the point where I said, well, okay, I'm going to just put all my just start putting my stuff out there. But I do have three trunk books, maybe four. I try not to think about them too much because most of them are never going to see the light of day. They're terrible, but they were great
We all
learning
have
experiences.
those. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but they were, like I remember I wrote like a kind of noir detective story set in Los Angeles when I didn't really even know Los Angeles. So it was one of those things where I'm like, oh, I really want to learn more about this time. So I'm going to do all this research, and got kind of pulled into that research trap that I talked about earlier, where, I'm doing nothing but research. And then when I finally sat down to it, it was just kind of this derivative pile of nonsense. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think this is going to go anywhere. But it was a great learning experience.
Mhm. And I think that's true for so many of those books that like almost were. There, you always learn something from them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, every time you sit down to work on a story, you're going to get hopefully a little bit better at the craft, and also hopefully like understand yourself a little bit more, so you understand like what kinds of stories you are more comfortable telling, and which stories require you to jump out of your comfort zone a little bit more. Um, yeah. So everything is kind of, every bit of water under the bridge is something that informs the later work.
Absolutely. So, can you tell me a little bit more about what that self-publishing process has looked like for you for your books?
Yeah. Unfortunately, when you self-publish, your primary job is really marketing.
Mhm.
And that's been a big adjustment for me, because I would much rather be the kind of writer who just like writes my stuff, send it off to an editor, and then, everything is kind of done from there. Um, but for me, it's, all the editing is done myself. All of the, tracking down people to design covers, that's all done myself. So I find that I spend a lot more um, time doing all the things that revolve around writing than I am able to do with the writing itself. Hence the small bits of time that I was talking about earlier, where you kind of have to, almost force yourself to schedule that time. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything else.
Mhm. For sure. And I have to say, you have incredible covers. Like you just have amazing covers. So being self-published, having to find those people, like I know that that can be a real struggle sometimes, but
Mhm.
they turned out beautifully.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I'm so pleased with the artists that I've worked with. The first two books were done by an artist named Faye Lane, and found her on Twitter. She's just does fantastic work, and she's super patient with me, and my kind of picky process of getting explaining, well, what if we put the blood here, what if we did that, just really patient, really great to work with. And then the new one, the novella, was done by Ruth Anna Evans, who is also a writer, in her own right, and is just fantastic. And we just clicked on that cover like right away, and it was just a very quick process, and it all just came together really nicely.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me a little bit about what are some things that you do to make your horror horrifying and how you up that fear factor?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that always struck me reading Stephen King was that his premises were not like super scary, but the reason they felt so scary was because you believed the characters, and you sort of took their fear on for yourself. So I feel like that's really important, is that you have to have characters that are realistic, characters that you can identify with, and, people who feel well-rounded and real, so that when they're afraid of something, then that fear kind of becomes your fear. And that's something I tried to do in Downpour, because when you think about it, like the way the story builds in the beginning, it's really this guy who's like worried about a rain cloud, and it's a very strange rain cloud. It's a very um, odd kind of thing to see in the sky, and he has other reasons. I don't want to spoil too much of the story, but he has other reasons for understanding that yes, this is a problem, but the rest of his family is not understanding where his fear is coming from. But hopefully as a reader, you do understand, because you're looking at the world through this guy's eyes, and you're seeing the information that only he has, that he's having trouble, because he's not a great communicator, having trouble imparting to his family. So that struggle hopefully is something that readers will absorb, and then it will just make everything that comes after that a little bit more frightening.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for sharing that. So I this is a little fluffy of a question, but
But,
do you have a favorite piece that you've written?
oh God. I don't know that I have like any favorite story. I mean, I love them all and hate them all kind of in equal measure because, there's always this feeling when you finish a book that, this could have been better. Or when you finish writing a story, like, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to make it any better than it is right now. And they say that art is never finished; it's always just abandoned, right? And so there's always kind of that feeling when you finish something like, yeah, okay, this is as good as it's going to get, right? So that's where the kind of disappointment part comes in. But then there's also those stories that have, like, there's a story in Suburban Monsters called The Stumbling Bum Imperative. And it's very much kind of rooted in a time in my life where my kids were watching these really strange, like, kids' TV shows, like Yo Gabba Gabba, and these shows that if you are just passing through in the room and you kind of see what's happening, it's a little jarring. It's a little bit unsettling, and I wanted to capture that in a story, and I felt like that one I came the closest to my original intent
Mhm.
with, so that might be the one that I would pick as a favorite. But yeah, I like to think I love them all in equal measure, and also I'm slightly disappointed by them all in equal measure.
And I feel that, yes. So kind of going back to what you were saying earlier about strong emphasis on characters and making sure that the audience will connect with your characters. How does that creation process look for you?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it really just comes down to finding a character that feels real to me, because a character, I can't really write a character until I have like a good idea, at least in my own head. And some writers do, like, mood boards and all this stuff, but I at least want to have like a concrete idea of who this character at least thinks that they are. And then as the story progresses, you can kind of explore whether that conception of self is actually what that person is in reality. And that give and take is kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, in terms of creative process, I mean, it's really, sometimes it's just, banging two ideas together to see if they stick. Sometimes, I'll get a short story idea that, kind of just jumps into my head fully formed, which is rare, but it happens. And, when it does, it's really energizing because, like, oh, okay, I have to get this down like right now. Um, but yeah, it's kind of all over the board. I mean, some things are a slog, some things are very quick. It's just, it depends on where your brain is at that day and where the ideas are at that day.
I think it's like those eureka moments you were talking about earlier. It's like they don't
Mhm.
happen often, but when they do, it's amazing and exciting, and it's like a huge part of why we write. But the majority of it is the work, and you have to kind of love the work.
This is true, yeah, because it's, there's a lot of talk about, like, writers being inspired, but you don't get inspired unless you're actually sitting. You have to be in a spot where you're receptive to the ideas and those moments that just kind of happen, and those connections that just kind of work out. But if you're not there applying yourself and doing the work, then those moments are never going to happen. So it's almost like, I kind of think of it a little bit like, the old guy in the stream, like, panning for gold, right? Like, I mean, there may be days or weeks where he doesn't find anything, but then, when he does, it's amazing.
For sure. Well, this has just been such an absolutely incredible interview. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
I just have one more question, and that is,
Sure.
what do you have coming up?
Well, I do have a short story that's going to be in an anthology. Um, it's, oh God, I'm blanking on the name, but the concept is that, um, 20 authors have been given uh, concepts that are all kind of, um, I'm not explaining this very well, but they all kind of grow out of this central idea of a moving company employee who brings a box into a house, and that box starts to shake and move, and the employee decides he's going to open the box, and then each of those writers then have a different take on what what he finds in that box and what the implications are. So the anthology is called Fragile, and it's coming out in October. I think it's going to be at AuthorCon 4 is going to be the first place where it's really available. But I have a story in there. There's a lot of other like amazing writers. Michael Allen Rose, who is a fantastic writer in his own right, has put all of this together, and it's just going to be um, a really fun piece when it's done. And then hopefully in April, March or April of next year, I'll have my next novel coming out. I don't want to say too much about it just yet, but it's sort of a horror, sci-fi, fantasy piece. A little hard to pigeonhole, a lot of cross-genre stuff going on, but I think it'll be a lot of fun.
That sounds amazing. I love a multi-genre book. So if you ever want to come back on the show, you are more than welcome to. This was really great. Thank
I
you.
would love to. Thank you so much.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Christopher Hawkins.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.